If safety protocols worked, the test would have been routine. If the reactor design were sound, the override wouldn't have mattered. Neither was true. And the result wasn't an accident, it was a sequence, each step locking the next into place. The safety trap. You're running a test that's supposed to last 4 minutes. It becomes the worst nuclear disaster in history. Operators need to check something simple. If power fails, can the spinning turbine generate enough residual electricity to keep the cooling pumps running until backup generators kick in? To run this test cleanly, they disable the automatic emergency cooling system. They bypass computer safeguards that would normally shut the reactor down if conditions got dangerous. This isn't recklessness in the way you'd imagine. It's procedure, signed off, documented. But the RBMK reactor underneath them has a personality. At low power, it's unstable, touchy, and now it has no automatic hand to catch it if it stumbles. People think Chernobyl was caused by an explosion. Actually, the explosion was the end of the story. The beginning was paperwork, a checklist that quietly removed every safety net before anyone touched anything dangerous. Picture the control room. Dim lighting, dozens of dials, men who've run this reactor for years. Confidence in the room, routine in their hands. They don't know they've just turned the core into something that can't defend itself. That's the quiet part nobody puts in the headlines. The disaster started with a decision that looked completely normal, but here's where it gets stranger. The xenon poisoning. The power doesn't spike, it collapses, and that collapse is what kills them. As the reactor runs, it produces a byproduct, xenon-135. Think of it as a sponge for neutrons. It eats the particles the reaction needs to sustain itself. Normally, this balances out, but during the test, power dips lower than planned, and xenon builds up fast, smothering the reaction. Power craters towards zero. The test is supposed to happen at a stable, low level. Instead, the reactor is dying in front of them. People think operators panicked and made a mistake. Actually, they made a calculated decision that made perfect sense in the moment and turned out to be the second domino. To fight the xenon and bring power back up, they pull the boron control rods out of the core, almost all of them. Boron absorbs neutrons. Pulling the rods is like opening every valve at once. It works, power comes back, but now there's nothing left inside the reactor to stop a surge if one happens. You can feel the tension here, even just imagining it. A room full of experienced engineers watching numbers that won't behave, making the only move left on the board. They don't know it's the wrong board. And that's not even the strange bit. The strange bit is what the steam itself was about to do. The prompt critical spike. This is the moment physics turns against the people in the room. As the core's cooling water starts to boil into steam pockets, the RBMK's most fatal design flaw activates, a positive void coefficient. Here's the plain version. Water absorbs neutrons. Steam doesn't, not nearly as well. So as more steam forms, more neutrons stay loose, and the reaction speeds up. Faster reaction makes more heat makes more steam. It feeds itself. People think nuclear reactors melt down slowly, gradually, like a pot left on the stove. Actually, this one didn't have minutes, it had seconds. In the space of a few heartbeats, the reactor's output rockets to over 100 times its rated maximum. Not double, not 10 times, 100. Imagine standing in that control room and watching a needle that's supposed to move gently suddenly slam off the chart. No alarm gives you enough warning for a number like that. The body doesn't even have time to feel fear before the next stage starts. Which leads to the part where someone finally tries to stop it and makes it worse. The control rod jam. The button meant to save the reactor is the button that destroys it. The shift supervisor sees what's happening and does the only thing anyone can do. He hits AZ5, the emergency shutdown. This should drop every control rod back into the core, smothering the reaction and boron almost instantly. It's the failsafe, the big red button. It's supposed to work. People think AZ5 failed to activate. Actually, it activated perfectly, and that's what made things catastrophic. The rods have graphite tips designed to displace water as they enter, but the fuel channels are already warped from the heat, already deformed. The rods jam halfway in, and because of that graphite tip design, a half-inserted rod doesn't slow the reaction down. For a moment, it speeds it up. This is the cruelest detail in the entire disaster. The safety mechanism, in its failure, briefly becomes an accelerant. You picture a man pressing a button meant to be his last line of defense, and that very motion making the monster bigger. But the core was already past saving. What happens next isn't really about the reactor anymore. It's about the building around it. The steam explosion. The roof of the reactor building doesn't get destroyed, it gets launched. The water flashes instantly into superheated steam, and the fuel channels, already stressed, already failing, shatter under the pressure. There's nowhere for that energy to go but up. It builds until it has only one exit, and that exit is the 2,000-ton steel and concrete lid sitting on top of the reactor, the biological shield, designed to contain radiation under normal conditions. People think nuclear disasters caused by one big bang. Actually, this is explosion number 2 of 2, and it's mechanical, not nuclear, pure pressure, doing what pressure does when it has nowhere left to go. That lid is blown clean off, straight through the roof of the building, landing on its side like a coin flipped by something the size of a mountain. For 1 second, the core of a nuclear reactor is sitting open to the sky, no containment, no barrier, just glowing wreckage and night air. And night air is exactly the problem. The hydrogen detonation. Oxygen rushes in, and the second explosion is worse than the first. Outside air pours into the open wound where the reactor used to be sealed. It mixes with hydrogen gas, produced when the superheated zirconium fuel clotting reacted with steam and with white-hot graphite. The combination ignites. A second blast, more violent than the first, tears through what's left of the structure. People think the first explosion was the disaster. Actually, this second one is what truly scatters the danger, flinging burning chunks of radioactive fuel and graphite across the rooftops of the entire facility, starting dozens of small fires on a building that's supposed to be the safest place for miles. Firefighters are about to arrive with no idea what they're walking into, no idea that the debris glittering on the rooftop isn't ash, it's death in pieces, still burning. What's left behind isn't finished, though. It's only beginning to sink. The elephant's foot. Somewhere below the wreckage, something's being born that will outlive everyone watching it form. Inside the ruined core, fuel rods reach past 2,000 degrees Celsius. Uranium fuel melts together with steel, sand, and concrete, a molten radioactive lava called corium. It doesn't stay still, it eats through the floor beneath it, dripping downward through level after level until it finally pools and hardens in a sub-basement. People think meltdowns mean the fuel simply vanishes or burns away. Actually, it becomes something new, a solid mass nicknamed the elephant's foot, dense, black, glassy, and so radioactive that even decades later, standing near it for a few minutes would be fatal. It still sits there today, cooling at a pace measured in centuries, not years, a monument that no one can visit in a room no one can safely enter. But while that's forming underground, something as dangerous is rising into the sky. The atmospheric fall. With no roof left, the fire below has built itself a chimney. The exposed graphite is still burning, and that burning column draws radioactive isotopes, iodine-131, cesium-137, straight up into the atmosphere, miles high. People think fallout is a localized event, something contained near the source. Actually, the wind doesn't care about borders. The plume drifts across Belarus, across Europe, contaminating soil and milk and forest hundreds of miles from a town most people had never heard of. This is the part with no explosion, no fire, no dramatic image, just an invisible cloud settling quietly onto fields where children are still playing outside. The damage here doesn't end in days or weeks, it ends in millennia. So which is the real disaster? The second it ignited, or the thousands of years it keeps unfolding, quietly, in soil no one can use again?